Uh, well, I was very surprised when I read Professor Feldman's paper, and it struck me as something that I disagreed with entirely from beginning to end. And so I read it again and thought some more about it, and I still find myself in rather complete disagreement with his conclusions. It seems to me that there is a level of belief or discourse where all these conclusions seem to me pretty reasonable. That is, when you're talking about everyday beliefs about everyday things, I think that you can use all these arguments. It would be ridiculous if we share our evidence about, for example, that we've seen Xerox machines out there, and that we don't have any different evidence about as to something going on in taking this machine, that one of us would believe that there are Xerox machines out there and the other one would not believe that there are Xerox machines. And it seems to me that in many cases, in many, if you like, low-level beliefs or everyday beliefs, I think that all these arguments are correct. I don't have any objection. The problem seems to me to arise when you get to philosophical theories, if you like, or philosophical positions. I don't particularly like to talk about philosophical positions in terms of philosophical beliefs, but we can talk also that way. There, I find myself not agreeing with that these kinds of considerations are relevant. Where exactly are you going to draw the line doesn't seem to me to be completely clear. I think that if you have very circumscribed situations where the evidence is pretty well defined and the problems are pretty well defined and the means of answering the problems are pretty well defined, then I think probably it's correct to say that you be hard to have such reasonable disagreements. But I don't know exactly where that goes. But I certainly think that if you take philosophical positions that not only I disagree with the conclusions, but I think that the notions that are used in the argument are not well defined. Now, I work on philosophy of mathematics and philosophy of logic, and there are a number of different positions. They can be Platonists, they can be nominalists, they can be constructivists of one sort or another. And most people agree that the evidence that you have, whatever that may be, does not conclusively support taking any of one of these positions, and that it's reasonable for people to have these, to take these different philosophical positions with respect to mathematics. Now, one of the problems I have is to understand, for example, who my epistemic peers are. Now, it seems that if you take a case like that, my epistemic peers would be people who are specialists, say, in philosophy of mathematics. But if you look at the definition of epistemic peers, you see that epistemic peers are people who are roughly equal with respect to intelligence, reasoning powers, background information, and so on. And it's not so easy to see that other specialists in philosophy of mathematics are epistemic peers in that sense. I mean, somebody might come to philosophy of mathematics from mathematics, and somebody might come from philosophy, and somebody might have a certain background information in philosophy, for example, that is quite different. Somebody might be a reader of Plato, and somebody else is a reader of Husserl. And all these things seem to me to be counted in when you look at the notion of epistemic peer. And it's not so easy to say that, for example, we are all epistemic peers vis-a-vis the Xerox machines in the other room, to say the same thing with respect to other people in philosophy of mathematics. Besides, I don't think that holding a philosophical position is just merely a question of evidence. I mean, although there is evidence of one sort or another that you can bring in about various questions and various issues in that position, is not just the evidence. I'm not basing my choice of Platonism or my choice of nominalism or my choice of some form of constructivism on evidence. I mean, there might be some of that, but it's certainly not the primary consideration. some people come up with the idea of philosophical intuition, for example, not exactly in the sense that and Sosa was discussing, or maybe perhaps it is. For example, a famous paper by Goodman and Quine that then it was kind of rejected by Quine, but open, saying we do not believe in abstract entities. This is a basic philosophical intuition that we cannot justify any further than that, and so on. And this is a very widespread attitude. Hartley Field opens his book on Science Without Numbers saying, I don't believe in abstract entities. And you find a lot of determining conditions that people adopt one position or other, not being evidential conditions, but certain kinds of preferences, philosophical preferences. So, so it's true that you can have certain specific questions within these positions. For example, one question in philosophy mathematics would be, are there abstract entities? Now, a Platonist, for example, would say, yes, there are abstract entities. But you can have different kinds of Platonists. How do they conceive of these abstract entities? Can they be properties? They might be sets. They might be objects or non-objects, and so on, right? And somebody else say, no, my position is that there are no abstract entities. Now, is it the case that when we hold, for example, when I hold in philosophy of mathematics that there are abstract entities, that I have to have the sort of evidence that I have for holding that there are Xerox machines out there, and that if I consider that somebody else can reasonably hold that there are no abstract entities, that then I should suspend belief. Well, if my holding that there are abstract entities were merely based on certain body of evidence that we both can share, then it seems to me that it might be plausible to take that conclusion. But I doubt very much that, I mean, certainly it's not true in my case. I do not hold that there are abstract entities on the basis of certain body of evidence that I can share with Hartley Field or with George Boulez or whoever. I mean, I have a whole attitude toward this position in the philosophy of mathematics, which is based partly on certain kinds of evidence, partly on aesthetic considerations, partly on the kind of unifying power that the theory has, and so on. Now, there is a distinction that we were talking this morning a little bit, Professor Feldman and I, about all of these, and there's a distinction that Carnap has between these internal and external questions, where the internal questions, then you go on and you have the means for answering them in the theory, and then the external questions are questions of choice. And, well, in a way, it seems that then you are taking some kind of skeptical position. You're saying, well, you know, you can choose all these different things, but there is no right of the matter. There is nobody is right in doing their choices. I don't agree with that. I think that, and for example, I'm not Aquinian, at least not right now. I used to be at some point. And I think Quine, for example, holds that all questions involve decision and choice and so on. I mean, there is nothing that is absolutely internal question, and there is nothing that is an absolute external question. And it seems to me that holding of a philosophical position is something that might involve cognition of some sort, but is not determined by the evidence that you have to choose that. I think that also the question of sharing evidence. I mean, Professor Feldman at some point he raises some restrictions about this idea of sharing evidence. I think when you get to this level of discussion, it's very hard to talk about shared evidence. It's very hard to see that people can share all their evidence, that people can discuss or put everything out and have it there to decide, okay, now we have shared everything. It's very easy in those cases that he gave, because, you know, you have the dean and you have the detective and you have these various cases. It's easy to conceive what it means to say that we are sharing our evidence, right? But not in these other cases. So just to conclude, I would say one more thing. I also think that believing is not something that is necessarily based on evidence. I was surprised that the paper begins with a discussion of religious belief. And one of the things that seems more or less typical about religious belief is that it's generally not based on evidence. I mean, people would not come to you and say, look, I have evidence here that there's God. No? They would say to you, I believe in God, I was raised that way, I have, all these various considerations, but they will not say, I have evidence, and the evidence is that gives me that religious belief. So it seems to me that not only this happens in questions like religious questions, where aside from belief you have faith, that is a very important consideration in having various kinds of religious beliefs, and which is not based on evidence, but also many times in political beliefs. The belief that a certain kind of system might be the best system for you to live under is not necessarily based on evidence, it seems to me. It's based on many other considerations. So, although I find myself in agreement, I'm just going to conclude here, although I find myself in agreement with Professor Feldman when we are talking about our everyday beliefs and our fairly well-identified situations, when we talk about these more general things, I find myself in almost complete disagreement with all his conclusions. Thank you.